The station, a lonely outpost at the edge of known space, floated silently in the dark abyss. Its glowing navigation lights flickered in the void, barely visible from the distance, the only sign of life in the vast emptiness. A massive array of sensors, communication relays, and defensive weapons encased the station, purposefully isolated, far from the busy trade routes and active sectors. This wasn't a place for visitors. It was for keeping watch, monitoring the vast stretches of uncharted space. Commander Dax Holt stood at the command station, his fingers gently tapping the console, his face etched with concentration. He wasn't expecting much from this station. No one ever did. The crew on board was small, just enough to maintain operations in this dead corner of the galaxy. Holt had been stationed here for 3 years now, and the monotonous hum of the station had become a second heartbeat. The long stretches of silence were a regular companion. He'd long given up hope of anything exciting ever happening. He had made peace with it. But today, there was something different. A faint pulse on the communication system, a ripple through the usual static of the deep void. At first, Holt assumed it was just a glitch. Must be interference, he muttered to himself, running his fingers through his short, dark hair. He was about to dismiss the signal when something caught his attention. The pulse, though faint, wasn't random. It repeated itself. For a moment, Holt paused. His brow furrowed. Not normal, he said under his breath, focusing more closely. He adjusted the console, running several checks to confirm the source. It wasn't a random error. This signal was originating from deep within uncharted space, a region not typically explored, even by the most ambitious fleets. The communications relay hummed as the signal amplified, gaining clarity. Captain Nolan needs to know about this, Holt murmured. He swiftly tapped his communicator, activating a secure line to the bridge of the station, where Captain Talia Nolan was overseeing operations. Commander Holt to Captain Nolan, he said, his voice steady but carrying a sense of urgency. We've got a strange pulse coming through the comms. Initial readings show it's a distress signal. A pause. Then, Talia Nolan's voice crackled through the comms. A distress signal? From where? Holt's eyes narrowed. He studied the readings carefully once more. It's coming from a sector we've written off as inactive. There shouldn't be any fleets out there. Nothing for miles, he explained, running another diagnostic check on the source. The signal was far too organized to be a random transmission. Captain Nolan's voice came back with a calm authority. Investigate it, Commander. We can't afford to ignore anything, especially if it's coming from so far out. Report back once you've got more data. Understood, Holt replied, cutting the communication. He immediately set the station's systems to run a more detailed analysis on the distress signal. As Holt continued his analysis, the signal grew stronger, clearer, and with it, the realization that something wasn't right. The source was not just a simple distress call from an isolated ship. This was a fleet under attack. Impossible, Holt whispered under his breath, the words slipping past him before he could stop them. He stared at the console, scanning through the incoming transmission once more. The fleet was out of range of any regular shipping lanes, and there were no reported ships from any of the major factions in that area. Nothing matched the characteristics of a common trade fleet. His pulse quickened. Holt set to work contacting his crew, preparing the station's scanning array to locate the fleet's exact position. The station's power systems hummed in the background as Holt ran the scan, his mind racing. Minutes passed. Then, Captain, he said, stepping quickly into the command room, his voice edged with urgency. I've found the source. They're taking heavy fire. There are at least 5 ships involved, and one of them's in serious distress. Talia Nolan stood by the large viewport, her face unreadable as she looked out at the distant stars. Without turning around, she asked, "Where exactly is it located?" Holt stepped up to her side, pointing to the map of the galaxy that was displayed across the hollow screen. Right here, he said, indicating a patch of dark space, a part of the galaxy that had long been considered uninhabited. It's too far from any established territories. We should have been the first ones to pick up on this. Nolan took a step back, considering the implications. Her voice softened. We've got no fleet in that sector. If there's anyone out there, they're on their own. The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Captain Nolan turned to Holt. Prepare the station. We're going in. Get us coordinates and whatever help we can offer. We don't leave anyone stranded. The words hit Holt with a strange sense of familiarity. Humanity didn't leave their own behind. As he moved toward the console to set the coordinates for the station's first jump, Holt couldn't help but feel a growing sense of unease. Something about this distress signal didn't sit right. There was more to this situation than they knew. They were not alone out here, and something was waiting for them in the void. The whisper in the dark was only the beginning. The bridge of the UHN Halcyon buzzed with a tense energy as the crew scrambled to interpret the incoming signal. The usual hum of the ship's systems was drowned out by the frantic tapping of keyboards and the soft whirring of consoles processing data. Captain Talia Nolan stood at the helm, her hands clasped behind her back, staring at the flickering display ahead. She could sense the anxiety building, thick in the air. Something was off, and she could feel it deep in her gut. Lieutenant Holt, the ship's communications officer, was hunched over his console, his brow furrowed in concentration. His fingers flew over the keyboard, the sounds of data shifting and translating punctuating the silence. Captain, we've decrypted most of the message, but it's fragmented, Holt said, his voice steady but laced with uncertainty. We're getting partial transmissions, but the signal source is incredibly distorted. Talia nodded, stepping forward to get a closer look. The screen flickered, showing a jumble of encrypted code, broken up by sections of alien language interspersed with human-readable words. Holt gestured toward the screen. It's a distress call, Captain, he explained. The signal was originally intended for a nearby fleet, but something happened to disrupt it. We're only getting parts of the message, but this part is clear enough. He cleared his throat before continuing. The message mentions an alien fleet under attack. There are mentions of civilian ships in distress, urgent needs for medical supplies, and an evacuation order. They're requesting immediate assistance. Talia absorbed the information, her mind racing. A fleet under attack. Civilian vessels at risk. The urgency of the message was undeniable. It could be a trap, but if it was genuine, then this was a humanitarian crisis waiting to happen. The weight of the situation pressed down on her shoulders. She glanced at Commander Roderick, standing beside her at the helm. His expression mirrored her thoughts. If this was a genuine distress signal, they had to act fast. Who sent this? Talia asked, her voice calm but firm. She knew Holt's expertise, but this was crucial. They needed answers. It's difficult to pinpoint, Holt replied, his fingers still dancing across the keyboard. The signal's distorted. There are encrypted sections where we can't break through yet. It could be meant for a specific group of ships, but the message was never completed. We're not sure if they intended to contact us or if it's just a beacon that got caught in the wrong hands. Talia thought for a moment, 1,000 possibilities flashing through her mind. A distress signal from an alien fleet, but why would they send it to a human vessel? What if it was meant for someone else? Commander Roderick suggested, his voice cautious but practical. The message is too jumbled to be specific. Maybe this was meant for another fleet that was closer. Talia turned toward Roderick, her eyes narrowed. The idea made sense, but it didn't sit right with her. Something about the urgency in the signal felt personal, like the message was reaching out, hoping for the right response. She shook her head. It's too direct to be a mistake, she murmured. It's too specific. I think it's meant for us, or at least meant to reach us. Captain, Holt said, breaking her thoughts. The signal source is coming from a point on the edge of the sector. It's a distress call from a fleet under attack, but we can't pinpoint their exact location. The tension in the room thickened. Talia knew this wasn't just a coincidence. The universe was vast, and the idea that a fleet would send a message meant for someone far off seemed strange. Talia took a deep breath, the decision heavy on her chest. We need to investigate. She straightened her shoulders and turned toward the rest of the bridge crew. Prepare the Halcyon. We're heading to the source of the distress signal. I want all crew on alert. A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. There was no turning back now. They were headed into unknown territory, and while the threat of ambush loomed large, the possibility that this was a genuine cry for help was too great to ignore. "Aye, Captain," Holt replied, his fingers already flying over the console, sending the orders to the crew. As the ship's engines hummed to life, Talia stood at the front of the bridge, her mind focused on the mission ahead. She could feel the weight of the decision. Investigating this distress call could change everything. Either it was a trap, or it was the first step toward something much larger. As the UHN Halcyon powered toward the coordinates, Talia knew one thing for certain: they were about to uncover something much bigger than a simple distress call. Something that would test their strength and their resolve in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The bridge of the Zelvari warship was filled with the soft hum of systems running efficiently, too efficiently. But for Commander Dax Holt, something felt off. The usual controlled environment of the ship, which had always been a source of comfort, now seemed suffocating. The sensors had picked up something, a faint signal, an anomaly, but no coordinates matched anything they knew. As he stood at the forward console, watching the scanner data flicker before him, Holt couldn't shake the unease creeping through his mind. It wasn't just the unknown signal. It was the lack of answers, the lack of any fleet in the immediate vicinity. "Commander Holt," the technician at the sensor station called, her voice shaking slightly. "We're still unable to pinpoint any fleet or known vessels in the vicinity of the signal." Dax's jaw tightened, his gaze sharp as he turned toward her. "What do you mean no fleet?" he asked, his voice low and controlled. "This system is a key trade route. There should be a fleet of ships here. Are we certain the signal is coming from the correct sector?" The technician nodded, but there was an unsettling hesitation in her movements. "Yes, Commander. But there's no traffic in range. Nothing. The signal is anomalous, but it's directed towards us." Dax's eyes narrowed as he stepped closer to the console. He leaned in, examining the data himself. The coordinates were precise, yet the surrounding space was barren, devoid of any friendly ships. "Keep searching," he commanded, his tone growing sharper. "We need to know who's out there." The technician nodded again, but Holt could feel the tension in the room begin to mount. The air was thick with unease. The crew's usual confident precision was beginning to unravel under the weight of the uncertainty. Dax stepped back from the console, pacing in the tight confines of the bridge. "How can we be the only ship in the area?" he muttered to himself. "A fleet of this size, there should be at least a dozen ships within 100 light-years of this system." The crew continued their attempts to triangulate the source of the signal, but the more they looked, the more the situation didn't add up. There was nothing. No sign of a fleet. No sign of any ship or station, just empty, cold space. The silence grew louder. Finally, the ship's communications officer spoke up, her voice tinged with apprehension. "Commander Holt, we've attempted all known channels to identify the signal source, but we've encountered nothing. No response from any sector fleet, no response from any other ships. It's like we're alone." The words hit like a physical blow. Holt's mind raced, the feeling of isolation creeping in. The Zelvari fleet had always been unmatched, its military presence vast and formidable, but now they were isolated. The barrenness of the sector seemed to stretch in all directions. For the first time, the true magnitude of their isolation set in. They weren't just out of touch with their allies, they were utterly alone in the void. Dax's instincts, honed from years of command experience, screamed at him. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. His eyes flicked to the view screen, which displayed the empty stars ahead of them. A few stray pieces of debris floated in the distance, relics of long-forgotten battles. But there was nothing else. No ships, no stations, no signs of activity. He turned sharply to Captain Verith, who had remained silent until now, studying the data with quiet concentration. "What do you think?" Holt asked, his voice low. "We've never encountered a situation like this. No fleet in the area, no signs of life. Could this be a trap?" Verith met his gaze, his eyes betraying the same growing concern. "It's possible," he replied, his voice tinged with doubt. "But we would have detected a trap. We would have known if there was something lying in wait." Dax's fingers curled into fists at his side. "What if we've missed something?" he asked, his tone sharp. "What if this isn't a trap at all, but something worse? Something we haven't even considered?" Verith paused, his expression unreadable, before he spoke again. "I don't know, Commander. But the signal is getting stronger." Dax took a deep breath, trying to steady his racing thoughts. The signal was no longer just an anomaly. It was now a call that only they had heard. And yet, the more they tried to focus on it, the more isolated they felt. As the crew continued their work, Holt couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, as if something, or someone, was out there, waiting. Waiting for them to make the first move. The growing sense of danger was palpable now. It was no longer just a vague unease. It was a real threat, one that crept under their skin and made the hairs on the back of their necks stand up. Dax's mind raced with possibilities, each one worse than the last. Were they truly alone in this sector? Or was something waiting in the shadows, something that wanted them to make the first move? The hours passed, the silence on the bridge growing heavier as the crew continued their work. They were in no position to act, not without more information. And yet, the growing sense of urgency made it feel like every second counted. Finally, Dax's patience snapped. "Enough," he growled. "Prepare the fleet to move into formation. Activate all weapons systems. We're not sitting here waiting to be picked off." The crew jumped into action. Commanders barked orders, officers scrambled across the room, and the entire ship shifted into readiness. Holt's voice echoed through the chamber as he surveyed his crew. "We might be alone in this, but we're not weak. We fight together, or we die alone. We don't let fear control us." But even as he said the words, Holt knew that fear wasn't just controlling them, it was growing. Something was out there. Something they hadn't prepared for. And it was only a matter of time before they would face it head-on. The battlefield stretched out before Commander Zorkan as his flagship hovered above the now-ruined human planet. It had been a simple mission, one that should have been completed in a matter of hours. His forces had overwhelmed the humans' weak defenses, pushing through their feeble counterattacks, capturing their cities with ease. The planet had been ripe for conquest, its technology primitive, its armies scattered and weak. Yet, here he was, standing at the helm of his ship, still feeling the tension ripple through his entire body. He had expected more resistance. He had expected the humans to fall faster, to give up more quickly. But now, as the last of their forces were captured, something about this victory didn't sit right. There was something off. "Commander," his first officer called from across the bridge, his voice cautious. "The human leader has been captured. What do you wish to do with him?" Zorkan turned slowly, his sharp mandibles clicking together as he regarded the officer. "We will do what we always do," he said, his voice cold. "We interrogate them, break them, and then we watch them beg for mercy. They're like any other species. Weak. Subservient. They will bend under the weight of their defeat." But as he spoke, his thoughts kept returning to the human leader, General Michael Darrow. The man had been stubborn, relentless, and more resilient than Zorkan had ever imagined. Every attempt to break him had failed. The man hadn't begged. He hadn't crumbled. He simply stood. Zorkan turned back to the viewport, his eyes narrowing. "The fleet will be ready to move out by morning," his officer continued. "Once the general is broken, we can turn our attention to the rest of their forces." But Zorkan wasn't listening anymore. His mind was elsewhere, on that human. The one that had defied him in every way. Just then, the communications officer's voice broke the silence. "Commander, we're receiving a transmission from the general's ship." Zorkan's brows furrowed. A transmission? He hadn't expected the humans to communicate under these circumstances. His eyes flashed with suspicion as he stepped toward the console. "Play it," he ordered, his voice sharp. The screen flickered to life, and there, standing alone in a darkened room, was General Michael Darrow. His uniform was torn, his face bruised and bloodied, but his eyes, those eyes, were as sharp and defiant as ever. "Commander Zorkan," Darrow's voice was rough but steady. "You've made a grave mistake." Zorkan stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in anger. "You're broken. Your forces are defeated. You have no leverage left. Why do you persist?" Darrow's lips twitched into a small, defiant grin. "Because I'm not the one who's broken." Zorkan felt a flicker of doubt. What was this human playing at? "You think you've won," Darrow continued, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is over. But you don't understand, you never understood." The commander's pulse quickened. "Understood what?" Darrow stepped closer to the screen. "You don't understand how we fight. You don't understand how we survive." The human's gaze locked onto Zorkan's, and for the first time since the battle had started, the commander felt something he hadn't anticipated: fear. True fear. "We fight not for ourselves," Darrow said, his voice almost a whisper, but it carried power. "We fight for each other. We fight for those we love. And we fight until we can't fight anymore. We fight because we don't know how to stop." Zorkan's mandibles clicked again, but this time it was not in anger, it was in realization. The general was not broken. The humans were not broken. Something shifted inside Zorkan, something deep and unsettling. He had miscalculated. He had underestimated the strength of these creatures. Darrow's grin widened, and Zorkan heard him mutter something under his breath. He leaned closer to the screen. "You thought we were weak. You thought we were easy prey." Darrow's voice grew firmer. "But we are not like any other species you've encountered. We have something more." Zorkan's body stiffened. His fingers tightened around the edge of the console. "You're the ones who are weak," Darrow continued, his voice growing colder. "You're too blind to see it." Before Zorkan could respond, the transmission cut off. Silence filled the room. Zorkan stood motionless, his mind racing. The human wasn't just stubborn, he was something more. A force of nature. The realization hit him with the full weight of a star's gravity. The humans weren't weak. They weren't inferior. They were a different kind of dangerous. And in that moment, Zorkan knew, this war was far from over. The tables had turned. The humans weren't just fighting for survival, they were fighting for each other. And that made them the most dangerous force in the galaxy. The sound of cannon fire filled the bridge of the Zelvari flagship, a steady rhythmic beat in the chaos that had enveloped the space around them. Commander Gorvax was no longer a warlord basking in his power. He was clutching the edge of his console, knuckles white, staring at the viewport in sheer disbelief. The human fleet had emerged from the warp undeterred. No hesitation, no calculated retreat. Just raw, overwhelming aggression. Their ships cut through the Zelvari forces like a knife through flesh. Nothing stopped them. A massive plasma bolt from one of the human warships tore through a Zelvari destroyer, splitting the ship in two. The blast was so intense that even Gorvax's flagship trembled from the force of the explosion. "Target that ship! Fire everything!" Gorvax barked, his voice hoarse with frustration. But the human ship did not falter. Instead, it barreled straight ahead, its damaged engine sputtering but still pushing forward, driving deeper into the fray. The human crew knew they had no time for tactics. No time to retreat. They could only move forward and overwhelm their enemies. The human ships were relentless. Despite the damage they sustained, despite the plasma burns and the system failures flashing across their terminals, the humans didn't stop. They kept coming, even as the Zelvari fired their deadliest weapons, even as their own hulls cracked and groaned under the pressure. The human ship's weapons never stopped firing, unleashing barrages of missiles, railgun blasts, and laser beams. "How are they still moving?" one of the Zelvari officers screamed. His voice was tinged with disbelief, the first seeds of panic sprouting across the bridge. Their fleet was better equipped, better positioned, but the humans were not following the rules of battle. They fought with a recklessness that defied any logic. They took the hits and kept moving. And every time they did, they struck back harder. On the main screen, a human ship limped forward, its hull riddled with scars and breaches. Its engines were flickering, barely functional. But still, it fired. A precise, well-aimed shot hit a Zelvari cruiser, blasting a hole clean through its reactor core. The explosion sent the cruiser spinning into space, a cloud of debris trailing behind it. "Get them off us!" The Zelvari commander screamed, but his words were drowned out by the deafening sound of human firepower, a constant barrage that seemed to multiply by the second. Despite the damage, despite the loss of their best ships, the human fleet was relentless. They were not afraid to die. Every time one of their ships fell, another one took its place, charging forward with renewed aggression. A Zelvari warship fired its main cannon at point-blank range, but the human ship simply maneuvered, sliding to the side, evading the blast with impossible precision. The Zelvari warship's weapon missed completely, and the human ship retaliated, ramming directly into the vulnerable flank of the alien ship. "No! They're insane," one officer muttered, watching in horror as the humans tore through their defenses, refusing to be stopped. Gorvax's claws dug into the console, his mind racing. He had seen many battles. He had fought and conquered countless worlds. But this was different. The humans were not fighting for territory or resources. They weren't even fighting for survival. They were fighting for each other. And that made them more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. The human fleet's unrelenting charge continued, their weapons lighting up the dark space between them and the Zelvari forces. The once proud, towering alien ships were now crippled, scattered, unable to stop the onslaught of human fury. In the midst of the battle, one of the Zelvari officers turned to Gorvax, his voice quaking. How can they keep fighting? The human ships took hit after hit, their hulls breaching, their engines destroyed, yet they kept coming. They didn't surrender. They didn't retreat. They fought as though their lives meant nothing, as if they had only one mission, to destroy the enemy at all costs. Gorvax's mind raced. His eyes scanned the carnage unfolding in front of him. The alien fleet was being overwhelmed. Destroyed. And the humans, they just kept fighting. The human warship that had been closest to destruction, its engines now completely out of power, still fired one last shot, hitting another Zelvari destroyer in the core. The explosion was massive, sending the alien ship into a spiraling, fiery descent into the abyss of space. The warlord realized the truth, though it came too late. He never stood a chance. The human fleet, battered, beaten, bruised beyond belief, were not just fighting for themselves. They were fighting for each other. And that, Gorvax knew now, was what made them unstoppable. He watched the human fleet tear through his forces, his mind racing to catch up with the staggering realization. Humans were not weak. They were inevitable. The Zelvari flagship drifted through space, now a hollow shell of its former self. The once gleaming metallic hull was now battered, blackened by the toll of battle. The human fleet had pulled back, leaving behind only the wreckage of what had once been a force that was supposed to conquer the galaxy. On the command deck, the atmosphere was heavy. The warlord, Gorvax, was slumped in his seat, the weight of his failure pressing down on him. His golden eyes, once sharp and confident, now seemed dulled by the realization that his empire, once unchallenged, had been reduced to rubble. Around him, the surviving officers of the Zelvari fleet moved with purpose, but none spoke. The room was filled with a thick silence, the kind that came after a battle that had not gone as planned. The human prisoner, now freed from his restraints, stood near the back of the room, watching everything unfold with a calmness that seemed out of place. His bruised face and battered body were a stark contrast to the unshaken resolve in his eyes. As the final Zelvari ships retreated, Gorvax finally spoke. "We lost," he said, his voice hoarse, almost barely a whisper. The human, still standing in the background, turned slightly, meeting his gaze. "No," the human replied, his voice calm, but full of weight. "You didn't lose. You never stood a chance." Gorvax's lips tightened in anger, but it was the quiet truth in the human's voice that unsettled him more than anything. He had underestimated them, he had believed the Zelvari Empire could crush humanity with ease. Yet, it was humanity who had outlasted them, fought harder, and turned the tide. The warlord knew it was over. The battle had shown that no amount of technological superiority could overcome the resilience that humans possessed. The human prisoner stepped forward, his movement slow and deliberate. He passed by the Zelvari officers, whose gaze remained averted, unwilling to face him directly. They had seen enough to know the truth: humanity was no longer a species to be underestimated. As he passed Gorvax, the human paused for a moment, his bloodied grin returning. The warlord stood up as the human walked by him, but there was no threat in his actions. The human wasn't afraid. "You know," the prisoner said, voice low and clear, "I didn't come here to fight." Gorvax remained silent, unsure whether to speak or to wait for the human to finish. "I came to remind you," the human continued, his voice cutting through the tense air. "You should have left us alone." With that, the human walked toward the exit, his back straight, his posture not one of defeat but of victory, a victory far beyond the battlefield. The last words he left echoed in the now quiet bridge. "You asked why we keep fighting? It's because we don't know how to lose." As the human exited the chamber, the final truth set in. Humanity would never be the galaxy's joke. They had become its reckoning. Gorvax stood motionless, staring at the space where the human had been moments ago. His mind replayed everything: the battle, the endurance of the humans, the unrelenting nature of their fight. And he realized one painful truth. The Zelvari had underestimated them. And it had cost them everything. He had expected humanity to break under pressure, to collapse, to fall easily. But they were the ones who stood tall, who survived, and who kept fighting long after they should have been dead. They had no weakness, not like the Zelvari had believed. They were inevitable. As the warlord gazed out at the darkened expanse of space, he knew that the galaxy would never again look at humans as weak. They were a force that couldn't be ignored. They had shown their power, their resilience, and their unbreakable will. And the galaxy would fear them forever.